Welcome, good Monday to everyone, good start of a new week, but please now be seated. We have an history lesson to go through. Today is the 248th year since the British government passed the Tea Act. This was an act designed to save the British East India Company by reducing the taxes on its tea and granting the sole right to trade to North America directly to the East India Company. Because the British government, very smartly, kept a very high tax on tea as opposed to the Dutch. The Dutch didn't have taxes on tea, which meant the East India Company was about to go bankrupt. So the solution from the parliament was trying to squeeze out the Americans, or we should say the British living in the 13 colonies yet to be Americans. This made them very angry after learning of this, which is what propped up, a few months later, the Boston Tea Party, the throwing off the ship of the crates of tea in the harbor of Boston, which would eventually then prop up the American Revolution. There you go. There's your history lesson for today. Don't be a greedy government. Right. What we're going over today is revisiting a concept we went over before the start of this expansion, which was scaling. What is scaling? What does it mean for a spec to scale well or to scale badly? How can you see if your spec can scale well or can scale badly, and why, more importantly, are we talking about it now? We're talking about it now for a couple of reasons. The reason number one is that with getting closer to 9.1, there are going to be people coming back into the game as usual when it comes to a big patch. And then, of course, before a new tier, there are going to be people thinking about rerolling, about changing spec, maybe changing classes altogether, maybe even roles. People are going to start sifting through articles, threads, posts, videos about top specs, top DPS, melee DPS, range DPS, best damage, who is flavor of the month, and whatnot. And they will read and hear things like, don't play this spec because it doesn't scale well. Or if you were looking into playing this spec, you're pretty safe because it scales super well. Or if you're expecting good result from this spec, you will have to wait deeper into the expansion because they scale well. And they are there listening to all of this going, okay, yeah, of course, it makes sense. Clearly. When in reality they have no idea what the fuck is going on. Why are these people mentioning scaling? What does it mean for a spec to become better than a different one without any buffs or nerfs or balance changes? What does it mean? How does that happen? That is one reason why we're talking about scaling. The second reason is because every new tier, scaling can change. Because that is when Blizzard comes in. And we will talk about this soon. So the concept of scaling is very simply, how much bang can you get for your buck? The bang is your performance and the buck is your secondary stat. So how much haste, crit and mastery can affect your performance? 50 item levels from now, 100 item levels from now, second or third tier into the expansion, whatever. How much more effectiveness can you get from these secondary stats? You noticed I have not mentioned versatility. I only mentioned the three main ones. Why? Because versatility is the worst of the secondary stats and basically has no scaling. To put this very simply, versatility works the exact same way for every single spec in the game. There is no passive, no talent, no legendary, no synergy with versatility with any kit of any spec. Yes, of course, tanks can get more value out of it because damage reduction is more important to them, but aside from that, if you have 10% versatility and you go to 20% deeper into the expansion, you will have the exact same value and exact same returns on any spec. It will not synergize, it will not change the way your spec plays whatsoever. Meanwhile, if you go from 10 to 20% crit, or from 10 to 20% haste, or 10 to 20% mastery, not only can you get a similar returns like a versatility, but you can also change the way the spec plays. You can interact with certain passives, with certain talents, with certain legendaries that benefit from crit, or from haste, or from mastery. This is not present in Verse, which is why, commonly, the spec that has versatility as its best in slot stat is doomed. It's a spec that has no scaling, it's a spec that is very front-loaded and will go out of the first tier of the expansion pretty high in damage, because the other specs which scale better because they want to go for other secondary stats, they don't have enough. Their item level is too low, the borrowed powers are not there yet, so Verse is taking over. But in 30, and then 50, and then 70 item levels, all those specs who are now starting to get more and more haste, or more and more mastery, will eventually overtake versatility in the long run. And as mentioned, is because Verse is the same for everyone, whereas crit or haste or mastery do different things. Take Paladin, for example. You have Crusader Strike, you have Judgment, you have Hammer of Wrath. the cooldown of these abilities is reduced by haste, whereas plenty of other specs and classes do not get cooldown reduction from haste. You have Critical Strike. Lava Burst from Elemental Shaman is a guaranteed critical strike, which means you get 0 value from scaling crit on this ability for Shaman. You can have Mastery, which can have huge fluctuations within different specs. Since I mentioned Shaman, Earthshock and Earthquake, the spenders of Elemental Shaman, also do not get affected by Mastery, for example, so they have 0 scaling in Mastery as well for those abilities. So the classes that can use the secondary stats, gaining the best possible values with the least amount of downsides, are the ones who will scale better. Because as mentioned, Verse is the same for everyone, which means whoever can get the most out of Haste or Crit or Mastery is the one that can scale the best over time. So the last time I mentioned all of this, I gave you the examples of Frost Decay and Windwalker as the 2 perfect examples of great scaling and garbage scaling. Now, to go for something different, we go for Assassination Rogue. Also because Assassination Rogue is on the rise, is performing very well in raid encounters, just about the strongest single target for melee specs, maybe together with Feral Druid. I wanted to show you the example between Doomblade and Dashing Scoundrel, because Doomblade is the legendary being used right now by Assassination. So Doomblade says that Mutilate deals an additional damage as bleed over 8 seconds, and then Envenom gets increased damage for each bleed on the target. So, of course, immediate synergy within the legendary, because you create an extra bleed, so your Envenom is already doing 5% more damage because of this bleed, and then you can look at how does it scale by looking at how many secondary stats are affected by this legendary. Let's look at Mastery. I'm not gonna put you on the spot. Mastery for Assassination is poison and bleed damage. Envenom, while being nature damage, is still counted as a poison, so the Mastery has 100% effectiveness here. It is affecting the Envenom damage and the bleed damage, so this legendary fully scales with Mastery. What about Haste and Crit? Haste and Crit here have barely any effect. Crit has no effect. And you're like, wait, what are you talking about? Envenom can't crit? What I mean by that is crit has no effect beyond what any other spec in the game can get from crit. Crit here has the only effect of having a chance to crit. Any spec in the game has a chance to crit. There is nothing extra that crit does in this legendary. It functions as normal. What about haste? Here, Envenom doesn't gain much of anything with haste. You can start looking at very minor things like haste can make you auto-attack faster, so you can generate more energy, so you have more energy for building combo points, so you have more combo points for using Envenom, therefore haste scales with Envenom. That is a very long stretch. That is a very minor scaling, okay? It's not that important. With the bleed, it's a little bit stronger, because the bleed from Mutilate is a hasted dot, which means the more haste you have, the more ticks of damage it's going to do. But again, it's also pretty minor, because the duration is pretty small and the base damage is just 45% of your Mutilate. So you're not hasting a very strong part of your damage. So it's okay. In the end, this legendary has very high scaling with Mastery, basically no scaling with crit, and very minor scaling with haste. Now look at Dashing Scoundrel. Envenom also gives your poisons 15% critical strike chance, and their crits generate 1 energy. Number 1, this one has full scaling with Mastery, because Mastery increases the damage of your poisons. This entire legendary is about poison, proccing, so that's full scaling with Mastery. Number 2, crit. This has extra scaling with crit, just like the example I made before. The previous legendary had no scaling with crit, because crit in that legendary was doing nothing extra, other than giving you a chance to crit. In here, it does not only 1 extra thing, it does 2. Number 1, you gain 15% more crit, so you will gain exponentially higher value from crit by stacking crit, because this one gives you 15% extra. Number 2, you can gain more value from this, because every crit now also gives you 1 energy. These are already 2 extra things you can gain from crit. So on top of having full scaling with Mastery, it has high scaling with crit. And number 3, haste. You're like, okay, what about haste here? What? The dot of the poison? Come on, that's not much damage, it shouldn't really count as much. The scaling for haste here is your auto attack. Your auto attack is of course fastened by your haste. The faster you attack, the more chances you have to proc the poison. Not only that, but here there is a classic example of double dipping. Double dipping is when 1 secondary stats directly affects another secondary stats, which in return might even affect the previous stat. In this case, crit gives you energy and haste makes you auto-attack faster, so you have more chances to crit, to gain energy. And those two feed off of each other, they have synergy within themselves. This legendary has full scaling with mastery, very high scaling with crit, and high scaling with haste. This is a classic example of a series of effects that can scale very well later into an expansion, the more stats you start growing on your character. Another last example for this is to compare the good old benchmark for garbage scaling, which is Windwalker, to a different spec. This time though, we will do something different and not go for Frost Decay, but I want you to look at the talent tree, the talent options of Windwalker. You can see when you go over these one by one that there isn't anything that synergizes with your spec. Nothing that gives you something extra, nothing that synergizes with your mastery and at the same time with crit. It's all just a single bonus effect on its own, in a vacuum, not really participating with the rest of your kit. If you look at Chi Burst, for example, hurls a torrent of Chi energy up to 40 yards, dealing attack power nature damage. Does it actually synergize with anything? Besides giving you 1 Chi, or a maximum of 2, on a 30-second cooldown, does it actually do anything else? Is it synergizing extra with mastery, with crit, with haste? No. Maybe with your mastery, because you have to use different abilities every time. Now you have an extra ability that you can use to rotate, and that's it. There's nothing else. If you're looking at one of the worst talents ever, Eye of the Tiger. Tiger Palm also applies Eye of the Tiger, dealing some minuscule irrelevant dot over 8 seconds. Does this dot do anything? Does hitting enemies with this dot on them make you do something special? Make you reduce the cooldown of certain abilities? Gives you extra chance to crit? Nothing. It's literally just an on its own, standalone, without interacting with anything else type of talent. Even the darling of Windwalker, Whirling Dragon Punch. Whirling Dragon Punch, while being very central to the entire build, doesn't actually have any particular scaling as a talent. It's just an ability on a 24-second cooldown, which coronates, which closes the loop of Windwalker Monk after using Fist of Fury and Rising Sun Kick. That's why it's so good, but when you have to look at the actual scaling of this ability later on into the expansion, it's not going to become stronger because you have more crit, or become stronger because you have more mastery, or become stronger because you have more haste. In fact, this is actually worse because having more haste and generating more combo points and being able to use finishers more quickly is not even that good here, because Fist of Fury's cooldown and Rising Sun Kick's cooldown can be reduced quite a bit below the actual cooldown of Whirling Dragon Punch, meaning that even if you scaled to that level, you're still getting cock-blocked by the cooldown of Whirling Dragon Punch. The only two things that can scale in this entire talent tree are Spiritual Focus, which unfortunately is in the same row of Whirling Dragon Punch, which means it's never taken, and Dance of Chi-Ji. Dance of Chi-Ji is a good example of scaling because it says spending Chi as a chance to make your next Spinning Crane Kick free, which means the more Chi you can generate, the more you can spend. You can generate more with haste. The talent itself also scales more, as more chances to proc, the more haste you have. So the more haste you have, the more Chi you can spend. The more Chi you can spend, the more times this can proc. The more time this procs, the more free Spinning Crane Kicks you can get. This is a decent example of a decent talent scaling decently with haste. Now, when you look at the kit of Fury Warrior, for example, is the spec of choice for today. You have Cruelty. Cruelty gives your Raging Blow a 30% chance to instantly reset its cooldown, on top of the chance it already has. Raging Blow generates rage. The more chances you have to reset it, the more you can use it, and even more rage can be generated. More rage generated can get you to rampage faster, can get you to do more damage. You can then take Anger Management. Every 20 rage you spend reduces the remaining cooldown of Recklessness. Oh, okay, so with Cruelty I can generate more rage because of Raging Blow resets. More rage generated means I spend more of it. Spending more of it means I get to reduce the cooldown of Recklessness even more. Guess what Recklessness does? 100% more rage generation. And now you have an example of two talents feeding off of each other. Cruelty gets me more rage to spend more rage to reduce the cooldown of Recklessness even more, so I can use Recklessness to generate more rage, to spend more rage. You have Frenzy, another talent that gives you haste, up to 8% haste. Guess what you do with haste? Faster auto attacks, faster GCD, more abilities being pressed, faster rage generation, which also means faster rage spent. And lastly, sudden death. Your attacks have a chance to reset the cooldown of execute, and the chance, of course, scales with haste. All of this is a perfect example of a very good set of talents that scale very well with haste, and technically very well with mastery, because the mastery of Fury is damage increased within Enrage, and generally speaking, a Fury warrior is always going to be within Enrage, so haste and mastery are both affected by this set of talents. Back to the original point I made for crit with the rogue legendary. Crit here isn't scaling, because you're not getting anything extra from crit from this set of talents. Crit can just give you a chance to do more damage and that's it. There is nothing from this set of talents which enhances your crit beyond what it normally does. So these are good examples of talents or specs or legendaries that can scale very well deeper into an expansion because the synergy they have with secondary stats is enhanced, is greater than others. Now, I mentioned at the start of the video that there was a second point, which brings us to talk about scaling now, which is Blizzard. The deeper we went into the expansions and the more borrowed powers we have gotten, the importance of scaling has gotten less and less prevalent. Many times in the past, we have gotten specs with little scaling, specs that generally get outscaled, become relevant and stay relevant deeper into the expansion because of borrowed powers. Essentially Blizzard intervening in the natural order of things, in the cycle of life, which makes a front-loaded, strong early, weak late type of spec go out of sync and become stronger when it shouldn't because of borrowed powers. A perfect example of this is Havoc Demon Hunter. Havoc Demon Hunter does not have very good scaling, yet in both Legion and more importantly BFA, they have gotten bailed out by some seriously powerful borrowed powers, which bypassed their issues with scaling. Meanwhile, in a completely different world, specs that do scale well but did not get powerful borrowed powers ended up being weak. For example, Subtlety Rogue. Subtlety Rogue has pretty good scaling, they have a very good mastery for doing damage late, yet in BFA, for example, they were very weak. You had specs which normally overtake others. This has been the cycle of life for Mage, for example. Arcane and more importantly Frost generally do overtake Fire Mage in scaling, yet in BFA we have seen what Corruption and Mechagon Bracers and Memory of Lucid Dreams borrowed powers did to Fire Mage. And then you can have the absolute worst situation, where the spec with little scaling get little borrowed powers, like Marksmanship, and the spec with good scaling gets good borrowed powers, like Beast Mastery Hunter with crit and mastery. So yes, scaling is important, and yes, it is still good and helpful to visualize which specs can have good scaling, which specs can have good scaling abilities deeper into an expansion, because Blizzard in the end is not going to touch all of your kit, is not going to add borrowed powers to everything. So being able to see, okay, this spec is doing well, this spec has good potential, can be helpful. However, there is still the fact that eventually we will be getting something new. Eventually we will be getting very likely two legendaries being equipable at the same time. That is already a type of power increase which might negate the strength of a spec in scaling or revitalize a spec with poor scaling because it's able to use two legendaries at the same time, which can bypass its weakness. So that is worth mentioning. Good and bad at scaling is no longer a black and white type of thing, which you can just write on a paper in permanent ink and it's gonna stay the same until the end of the expansion. We do have intervention from Blizzard and from borrowed powers that can affect significantly how a spec can perform later into an expansion, even if the scaling would suggest certain specs being powerful and other specs not. We have now seen, at least for a couple of expansions, at least since Legion, with the widespread usage of borrowed powers, that it can very easily be turned around. So I hope this can make you understand a little bit better what scaling is and what it implies when it is being talked about in a normal conversation about this game. However, I also hope it's going to help you understand that while it is true, while several spec in their default state, in their natural state, do scale better than others, can simply do more damage than others. If you just drop on them 50 more item levels, it does not mean it is going to turn out in the exact same way when you factor in the unpredictability of the extra systems added by Blizzard, deeper into an expansion. So we can stop here with this informative video for today. Who knows what's gonna be up for tomorrow? Thank you anyways for watching the video. If you haven't not enjoyed this, don't make not sure to subscribe. I think that was right. Now, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, borrowed powers or not, I still want the elemental mastery to go away. Please.